So today's webinar is going to be based on the importance of HR documentation, and it'll be with me. My name's Sarah Hudson. Just to give you a bit of detail about Clover HR, we are a HR specialist. We provide consultancy to clients based across the UK, and we have a number of HR business partners within our team, and we bespoke our advice to our clients and their industry to give really a very good local presence to a client, but as I say, we are also spread out across the UK. Just briefly to let you know, because this is something that we're particularly proud of, Clover HR currently has been awarded the ISO 9001 for organisation of documentation quality management system. So we're telling people about this because we are quite specialist in receiving this award and proud of ourselves, so we're letting everybody know about that. And to introduce myself again, so I'm Sarah Hudson. I'm an Associate Director and HR Business Partner with Clover HR, and I'll be leading the webinar today. So just to let you know what we're going to go through today. So the importance of HR documentation is a very broad subject. So we're narrowing it down a little bit here into look at these fields. So we're looking at recruitment documents, because this is the first stage of gathering documentation on a person. We're going to look at policy documents, HR files, the impact of GDPR, and the dangers of not keeping the correct documentation. So, as I say, we're going to start with recruitment documents. So we're going to discuss some documents that we provided as part of the recruitment process and the significance of these. So I'm going to start with job descriptions, because this is a good starting point. It's what you would first do when looking at recruiting somebody. So the job description gives both the business and the employee a clear idea of the necessities of a specific job. The job description plots out every one of the obligations and duties that are related to a specific role. And it likewise gives a sign of the sort of abilities that are required to effectively carry out that specific work. And this is often detailed within the job description in a personal specification. So for example, it might list things like communication skills, resilience. So these are personal skills as well as the job-based skills. So the job description sets out what you expect from a role, and it means that everybody is aware of what is expected. Then we come on to the contract and offer letter. So this is a signed piece of documentation, and it acts as proof of the agreement between an employer and employee. The employment contract states the rights and responsibilities of both parties, and it's a legal requirement that the employer provides a basic statement of terms on the first day and a full contract within 2 months of employment. So we recommend having a contract template ready to go, so you can provide the whole contract on day one, if not before. If the employee historically hasn't got one, terms are implied. So whatever they are currently doing for you, those are the implied terms and conditions that would apply for that role. But we would suggest that if you don't have contracts in place, that you arrange for a written one to be produced as soon as possible, so that you have that clear definition of what the arrangement is between employer and employee. And then we have reference checks. So this is the reasons for these is to validate the information that you're receiving from an employee's or a new employee's CV. A reference can verify whether the candidate has the job experience and the skills that they claim to have. It also can gain an insight into the candidate's work ethic, and a reference can give a glimpse into the candidate's character, such as their willingness to work hard, meet challenges, whatever it may be that the person writing the reference thinks is particularly relevant for you to understand about them. You can issue the contract on the basis that a reference needs to be returned and is a satisfactory reference. So you don't necessarily have to get the reference, and often you won't be able to get the reference until you have offered somebody a role, but their contract is based on that being a satisfactory reference. And by that, we're kind of looking at the dates match up with their work history, and there's nothing glaringly obvious that they're telling you that is not correct. So moving on to some more recruitment documents that are important to ensure you have. Right to work. So this is a legal requirement that you need to make sure that somebody has the right to work in the UK, and it needs to be done for every single employee that you employ. So for the right to work checks, you need to check specific documents, and these are dictated by the government, and they can be found on the government website. So I'm not going to go into massive detail on the types of document that you would expect to see as part of a right to work. You can find that it's all laid out for you by the government, but you need to make sure that you have seen those documents. So in order to carry out the checks, you need to check that the documents are genuine, they're original, and they're unchanged, and they belong to the person that's given them to you. You need to check that the applicant's right to work in the UK hasn't expired. You need to check that photos are the same across all the documentation and that they look like the applicant in person. You need to check that dates of birth are the same across all documentation, and that the applicant has permission to do the type of work that you're offering. For example, including any limitations on the number of hours that they may be able to do. For students, you need to also see evidence of their study and what their vacation times are, just to make sure that you're following the correct limitations on the work that they can do. If there are two documents giving different names, the applicant needs to have supporting document to show why they're different. So for example, a marriage certificate or a divorce decree. Now with COVID, there's been some changes in how right to works can be done. So in terms of seeing original documentation, again, there's details of this on the government website to give guidance, and it includes things like doing these checks in person, but over a video call rather than in the same room, but also to just point out that these are temporary changes, and they are not going to be ongoing. There will be limits to how long this will run for. So next document to look at, and this is really just if it is relevant to your business, you may want to look at a DBS certificate. So this is essentially a check on someone's criminal record. The types of roles that you'll be looking at needing this for would be somebody working in healthcare perhaps, or with children or vulnerable adults. So it isn't a general requirement, it will depend on the role that the person is doing. And again, this is something that as specialists we could look into for you to understand the requirements for your business around how that would work for you. And then finally on the recruitment documents, we've got the induction documents. So this is really when someone is actually within the business, all the other documentation has been organised. And this is to confirm that they have the documents. So going through the induction process, making sure that they understand the handbook, which we will talk about in a moment, and policies, again, we'll talk about in a moment, but also to make sure they've done all the health and safety compliance that might be necessary before they can start the role, make sure that they know the organisation, they know who they'll be reporting into, and they've received any equipment that they might need, for example, a laptop or a phone. And as part of that, they will be able to have documentation signed off to say that they have received that equipment and what condition that equipment's in, so that at the point that it is handed back, you know what condition it should be in being handed back to you. So moving away from recruitment documents, I'm going to talk about policy documents. So policy documents and the employee handbook are the company produced documentation, and it's made available to all employees. The handbook is a legal requirement where you've got over 12 employees. And within the handbook, you have all information that is relevant to the employees. It can include, for example, how to book holidays. notice requirements to give, statutory amounts that somebody would be entitled to, for example, maternity, paternity, adoption pay, things like this. Really, anything that you can think of that an employee may need easy access to the information. And often the employee handbook will refer to policy documents. And policy documents are essentially, the policy talks about what the business stance is on an issue. So for example, bullying and harassment will detail what is meant by these terms, what the business understands these terms to mean, and what unacceptable behaviour around this looks like. Also, if you are found guilty of doing something inappropriate within these terms, it will discuss the penalties for this. So, for example, an employee found guilty of bullying and harassing may be dismissed for gross misconduct. So it will give the consequences of action by the employee, so that they're aware of what may happen under certain circumstances. So again, the policy documentation gives you and the employee an understanding of the rights and responsibilities between both parties. So it's kind of an extension of the information within the contract. And I've listed here some policies that we would suggest are essential to have as part of a business. So maternity, paternity and adoption, laying out all the details of the entitlements there, pay, etc. An absence policy, so that the employee understands what they do, for example, on the first day of absence, who they need to contact, what documentation they need to complete, for example, when they come back to work, any return to work documentations that are necessary. A performance policy, so that somebody can understand what happens if their performance is not where it should be. A redundancy policy to detail what would happen in those circumstances. Equality and diversity and equal opportunities policies. And again, this sets out the company's position on these topics and consequences of an employee not fulfilling their requirements within that. Data protection policy, so understanding what's happening with data that's collated. Bullying and harassment, again, like the equality, diversity and the equal opportunities, to set out the company's stance on what is not acceptable and the consequences of unacceptable action. And then the disciplinary and grievance policy and procedure. And again, this sets out what would happen if somebody were to breach a policy or do something that was unacceptable, the process that the business would go through, so that everything is clear and upfront in terms of how the business would deal with any events that arise during the employee's employment with them. So moving on to the HR file. So what I've done is listed here some of the essentials that we would expect to see in a HR file. So one of the main things is emergency contact details. This is particularly important for if there is, unfortunately, any kind of emergency with an employee. So for example, an accident at work or an ill health situation at work, so that you would be able to contact their next of kin as soon as possible. The contract would be on your HR file. Any change of contracts, so for example, an addendum to the contract with any changes to, for example, working time, any pay rise letters, which would obviously reflect a change to the original contract's pay, recruitment documents, and we've gone over a number of these before, but for example, the right to work documents, so that there is evidence that the right to work checks have been done. Appraisal documents, again, this is important to have that historical documentation available for the next appraisal, so that you can compare and contrast what has happened within the year of holding an appraisal. Any disciplinary and grievance documentations, including warning outcome letters. These are live, any that are live on file at the moment, and perhaps some more limited documentation to reflect what may have been previously live on file. Signed receipt of policy documents so that you as a business have confirmation that the employee has read and processed that information, particularly around rules and regulations that they cannot breach and consequences of that, so that you are comfortable that they are aware of their obligations. Holiday entitlement booking forms so that you know who's going to be in the business when you need them. And same absence documentation so that you understand not only who is within the business at a certain time, but also anything that you need to be aware of in terms of medical circumstances of someone. For example, if you need to make any adjustments to their job role. So I'm now going to go on to GDPR requirements, and this is particularly pertinent because of looking at the HR file. So within your HR file, you are storing personal information. So just a bit of a summary on the general data protection regulations. The GDPR regulations apply to personal information. So personal information is quite broad under GDPR, and it includes any information relating to an individual or an identifiable person who can be identified, for example, by reference to a name, an ID number, location data, an online identifier, or to one or more factors specific to their physical, psychological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity of that person. So it's quite broad. We would suggest that pretty much most information stored on a personnel file is going to be personal information, hence the name HR personnel file. So on the basis that the HR file contains personal information, it must remain confidential and secure. Only those who need to have access should have access to that information. And we would suggest by that really only a HR personnel or potentially a manager, but then also limited to what that manager can see on a needs to basis. We actually recommend, as part of our services, we recommend a partner for a HR system which contains the ability to store personnel information on a cloud. And we partner with Breathe HR, who provide that facility. So in terms of what data to keep, HR documentation is kept on a legitimate basis under the GDPR regulations. So by that, we mean that the information is needed to perform an employment contract or to comply with legal obligations or to further a legitimate interest of the employer. So you need to consider whether the information falls under this basis. An example being, we may need to keep bank details of an employee, and we would need to keep that to fulfill their contract because we need to make sure that they are paid. So we have a legitimate basis for why we need that information. In terms of how long to keep information, the GDPR regulations don't set out a minimum or maximum time limit on keeping staff data, but it does state that you shouldn't keep personal information for longer than you need to. So the length of time that you keep data will depend on the reason why you've collected it. So for example, if you collect an employee's contact number to use in case of an emergency, it isn't necessary to keep this once the employee leaves. However, there are pieces of data that you will need to keep for longer. And again, you will have legitimate reasons for this. So for example, there are some legal requirements that need to be followed. Working time records, they need to be kept for 2 years from the date that the records are referred to. So this may extend longer than the end date of employment for somebody. Again, payroll records, these need to be kept for 3 years from the end of the tax period that they relate to. Again, maternity, paternity, shared parental pay records, these need to be kept for 3 years after the end of the tax year that the payment is stopped. So after an employee leaves, you shouldn't just get rid of their records straight away. You might need them, and you might need them, for example, to defend yourself in tribunal. Generally, an employee can make a claim to an employment tribunal within 3 months of their employment ending. But depending on the claim, that limit can be 6 months or longer. If an employee, for example, claims that they've suffered from breach of contract, they might take you to the civil courts. Now, in order to do this, they can do so within a time period of 6 years from the alleged breach. So as a result, we would suggest on a standard basis that personal data be kept for 6 years after an employee leaves employment. What we can offer as part of our service from Clover HR is to come in and do a review of your personnel data from a GDPR point of view, to see what data you have, what data you're collating, how it's stored, and whether it should be stored. And if it should be stored, then how long it should be stored for. Another point just to mention is also subject access requests. And these are from potentially a former employee as well as a current employee, or really anyone that you hold data on. And they can issue a subject access request to see what data you're holding on them. And there is a time limit for your response on this. You need to respond within 1 month of receiving the request. So in light of this, it is very important to have all your data easily available and to know what data you're holding and where. So I'm going to talk now about the dangers of not keeping the correct documentation. I suppose the obvious one here is if there is a dispute between the employer and the employee, and you potentially end up in an employment tribunal situation. So as part of an employment tribunal, there is a duty of disclosure required by both parties. So both parties need to provide a list of documentation that may be relevant to a case. And you need to be aware that the parties must disclose all documents that are relevant, not just those that help their case. So again, you need to understand what information you're keeping about your employees and whether it's relevant to be keeping that. A lack of documentation that is then relied on by the employer in tribunal can really damage the case if they don't have that documentation available, particularly if it is really relevant information that legally they should hold on the employee, for example, an employment contract laying out terms. An example of how you may come across a problem in a tribunal: if an employee is dismissed for sickness absence, but then the employer doesn't keep the medical records or return to work documentation, that could result in a successful claim for unfair dismissal, as they can't prove the reason for dismissal. They haven't got their documentation to show the reasoning behind the decision that was made. It's also damaging in tribunal if there's damaged documentation or lost documentation or destroyed documentation, and that is very much worth keeping in mind before deciding what to do with your HR documentation. Also, not having the correct documentation in place at the right time, particularly if you're relying on that document, say, for example, something that's stated in a policy, but that policy wasn't in place at the time that's being referenced during the tribunal claim, that can have a significant impact and damage the claim as well. Second point to note is professionalism. And by this, I'm talking about how you want to portray your organisation. So a professional organisation has its policies and procedures in place. It knows where all its documentation is, and it can access that easily, particularly if someone requests it. This is quite prevalent, I think, as an important point during the recruitment process. So the professionalism in terms of having your job description laid out so that somebody coming to your business can understand what that role requires, what you're laying out, and that you understand what you're doing as well. And it can impact right at that beginning stage the employee's view of the organisation, and also the standard of documentation is important as well for that view. Moving on to engagement and motivation. So Consider how the content of a badly worded HR document can affect motivation and engagement of the employee. So if it feels to them that there's not a sense of seriousness in the documentation, that it perhaps skirts over some issues that they think would be particularly relevant, that can have a massive impact on engagement and motivation of the employee. And then finally, legal changes and updates. So by this, I mean any changes that may affect your documentation. So thinking particularly about contracts of employment or policy documents. So we suggest a yearly review of HR documentation just to take into account changes to case law or statutory changes. So for example, in 2019, there were changes to what needed to be included in the contract of employment. So we worked with a lot of our clients to go through their contracts, change their standard templates, and if there are any relevant changes that need to be issued to employees, that we would help with that process as well. So just finally, in summary, to highlight again, HR documentation is really important and it's part of the employee's relationship with the employer. It sets out rights and responsibilities and expectations. It's important that this information is kept securely and for a limited time as necessary. So you're not keeping documentation forever. You are following the guidance and keeping it as far as necessary only. And not keeping HR documentation correctly can have quite dire consequences, particularly if you end up in tribunal because of that. So as you can see from here, there's a lot of onus on the employer to make sure that they have the correct documentation, it's stored correctly, etc. This is something that, that Clover HR can help with. We've got quite a lot of experience of dealing with these kind of cases, and we can be proactive and make sure that the information that's being stored is correct and needed, and we can fill any gaps if that's necessary as well. So thank you for attending today's webinar. I hope you found it useful and of interest. As I said at the beginning, HR documentation, it's such a wide-ranging subject, so I've narrowed it in a little bit and talked about some of the particularly relevant points. But if there's anything further you'd like to discuss with somebody from Clover, please do feel free to contact us. As you can see from the screen, our mission is to be outstanding, trusted people advisors and to partner with businesses every day. Our values are to be trustworthy, of excellence, to be supportive, reliable and flexible. And there's some information here just about the beginnings of Clover, which I won't go into, but if you do want to have a look at this, they are on our website as well. So thank you very much for joining me today. I'm just going to check on the chat here. So I've just had a question asking, so for best practice, if you don't have a contract in place, should you backdate? I would suggest that you put a contract in place, yes. You would date it for their start date, but they would sign it as of today's date. So they would need to check over that contract and make sure that as the employee, they're happy that that reflects what they are currently doing, the terms that they have. So yes, it's worth putting a contract in place now. It should be signed at the relevant date of today, but you can backdate the start date to the original start date. Another question, is written data okay for files? Yes, any kind of information that you have, even if it's a scribbled note that is relevant, then it's worth uploading, onto a cloud if possible, but keeping in a personnel file if necessary. I've also been asked the question whether we can share the contents of today's webinar. We aren't providing the slides themselves. However, you can go onto our website and this presentation will be up and available. So if you want to look through this again, maybe fast forward to some of the bits that you're particularly relevant to you, then please do feel free to do so. So again, thank you everybody for coming in today. It's coming online with me today. It's been very useful for me just to kind of get some of that feedback as well at the end there. And I hope you found it useful as well. So thank you again and goodbye.